Everyone, welcome to our today's discussion. My name is Bijan Ahmadi. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. This is our sixth panel discussion since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope you and your family and loved ones are safe and healthy. We have a timely discussion today about the impact of China's rise on the international order. For around 40 minutes, I'll have an initial discussion with our panelists, and then I will ask some of your questions. If you would like to submit any questions, please use the Q&A feature that is available on Zoom. Before I introduce our panelists, let me briefly talk about our institute. The Institute for Peace and Diplomacy is a Canadian nonprofit and nonpartisan foreign policy think tank dedicated to promoting sustainable peace through diplomacy, dialogue, and constructive engagement. We believe that in a time as dynamic and transformative as ours, there is a critical need for unconventional thinking and independent voices in statecraft and foreign policy. Through its publications, conferences, policy briefings, and recommendations, IPD will encourage policymakers and leaders in government, civil society, and business community to adopt a more restrained and open-minded approach in managing the strategic challenges and geopolitical risks of the 21st century. Among our audience today, we have many policymakers, current and former diplomats, researchers, parliamentarians, business leaders, and journalists. To everyone tuning in, thank you for your attendance today. Now let me briefly introduce our panel of experts. Each of our panelists have years of experience and many accomplishments. We have the link of their full bios on our website, but I'm only going to provide a very short version of their bios in the introduction right now. First, from Beijing, we have Victor Gao. He's the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization and also a chair professor at Soochow University. Mr. Gao was the official English interpreter of China's leader Deng Xiaoping. Victor is also the chairman of the Yale Law School Association of China. Robert Ross is professor of political science at Boston College and associate and executive committee member of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University and a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute. His research focuses on Chinese security and defense policy, East Asian security, and US-China relations. Jeffrey Reeves is the Vice President of Research at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Prior to joining APF Canada, he was the Director of Asian Studies at the United States Army War College. He has direct experience living and working in Asia in different institutions, including as a university instructor at Peking University in China. To start the discussion, I would like to ask each of our panelists to give us their perspective on China's vision of international order and their assessment on what impact they think China's rise will have on the current world order. We start with Victor. Please go ahead. And please unmute first and then go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my great honor and great privilege to attend this very important webinar. And I would say peace and development overall context as we are going through very choppy and difficult time in the world. We see lots of changes, and I would say over the past 41 years the peaceful rise of China is a major transformative change in the world. And how do we interpret this and how do we define these changes? Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, when he spoke at the Nixon Presidential Library a few days ago, he was talking about the world will not be safe if China does not change. And I would say the truth is that probably no other country has changed more and more profoundly than as 51 years. If the change for peace, for development, and for mankind as a whole, China welcomes all these changes yet to come. And China is never complacent or stopping in experiments for more changes. But if the changes are to stop China's peaceful rise, to deprive the Chinese people their right to improve their living standards, then the Chinese people will not tolerate that. we want to unite behind the Chinese government to drive for more development. And this actually not only for the benefit of the Chinese people, but for mankind as a whole. You talk about international order. I would say China has been the major beneficiary of living within the current international order, however we define it. And China has been really doing it and trying its best to be in peaceful coexistence with all the countries in the world. Now, how China would define its role and the world order as we understand it, several things stand out very importantly. One is equality. China treats all the countries, about 200 of them within the United Nations family, as equals, no matter whether you are big or small, whether you are more powerful than others, for example. Every country is equal in terms of your sovereignty, in terms of your territorial integrity, and in terms of your right to peaceful development. The second thing is that China does believe that based on its own history of more than 5,000 years of continuous uninterrupted civilization, China does have a voice in the world. But this voice is within the framework of the current international order. China is not rocking the boat, and China is not destroying the current international order as we see it in achieving its transformation over the past 40 years. And I would say China will be very happy to continue to be a very responsible stakeholder within the current international order based on our common interest to strive for peace and development and betterment of the living standards of our own people. Now, the second thing I think China is very much interested in is reciprocity. That is, you don't do to others what you don't want others to do to you, and the same applies to the other side. If you treat others with equality and reason and rationality, then you should be reciprocated. This puts China at a big difference from some other major country in the world, which wants to put itself on top of the others, which wants to develop itself probably ahead of others, which wants to monopolize vaccine, for example, rather than joining WHO to develop vaccine and declaring that the vaccine, if they really become successful, will need to be international public goods to be shared by mankind as a whole. In this way, I think China is unique among major powers in the sense of a greater sense of responsibility, a greater sense of accountability, and a greater sense of living together. This is what President Xi Jinping has been calling about for the past few years. That is the shared common interest of mankind. Everyone, all the more than 7 billion people of mankind should live on the same world as equal, with equal rights, and endowed with the privilege of development. And no country should put itself on top of any other countries. And also, I would say, truth is not what just you talk about. Truth is to be experimented and borne out by your track record. This is what Deng Xiaoping said many years ago. That is, practice is the only real test of truth. And I think China's transformation over the past 41 years is an exact example. Whether the Chinese system or the American system or the Western system is good or not that good, you don't just talk about it, you put it to practice and you see what is the result. If your science is really very good, then exercise your leadership and contain the spread of COVID-19, for example. Save your people from dying, save your people from getting infected. This is how China looks at the current challenges in the world. And this is what China has been doing over the past 40 years. 40 years ago, China thought that socialism was much better than capitalism. When Deng Xiaoping re-emerged as the paramount leader of China, and I had the great honor of interpreting for him in the 1980s, Deng didn't buy that. Deng basically said, if socialism resulted in poverty, that must be a bad system. And the socialism that China will need to have is a system that will take on everything that is good and that is working, every other political system in the world, and we bring them back to China. And we come up with what we call socialism with Chinese characteristics. But that system need to work. That system need to bring bread and butter to the people. And I think this kind of pragmatism and realism and this kind of avoiding any kind of dogmatism is the key of Chinese emancipation over the past 41 years. And today, when China is already the second largest economy in the world by official exchange rate calculation, but is already the largest economy if we use purchasing power parity, China is not complacent. China doesn't believe it has the exact paradigm for development. China believes what it has been doing is exactly what China, given its very complicated circumstances, would need for itself. And China is the largest exporter in the world, but China does not export ideology or political system or its view of the world order. And I would say China's development is really a contributing factor to world development. Over the past several years, China's development has been accounting for more than a quarter of the additional growth of the global GDP. And I think this will continue to be the case. Now, from China's perspective, looking forward, we believe that in another 10 to 15 years' time, China will outgrow the size of the US as an economy, and China will surely become the largest economy in the world. But
thank you, Victor. I'll ask you more about all of this, but if you don't mind, let's go for the opening statements to Robert now. Please go ahead.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Bijan, and thank you to the Institute for this opportunity. The question Bijan raised is China a revisionist power with what implications? And my immediate response is, of course, China is a revisionist power. The rules of the game, the rules of the organizations, the strategic order were all set, for the most part, after 1945 by the United States, when China was bedeviled by civil war, occupied by foreign powers, and then spent the next 20, 30 years experiencing and recovering from the Maoist era. The rules were made without China at the table, and as Li Shenlong has pointed out, it is only natural that China would now want a voice and to revise those rules to make them more appropriate to Chinese interests. This is not something which is either extraordinary or out of the ordinary or unexpected. This is what great powers do. So whether it's the trade system, whether it's the financial system, whether it's the strategic order of East Asia, China will insist on change. So the question we need to ask is not whether China is revisionist, of course it is. But the question we have to ask is how fundamental are the changes that China wants? What are the implications for global stability? And how aggressive China has been in pursuing those objectives? And are they incurring excessive costs on other countries, disproportionate to the interests at stake? And I would say on both those issues, we're seeing a fairly moderate China. As far as revisionist China goes, China, of course, was denied leadership in the WTO, was denied leadership in the IMF, leadership that might have been commensurate with its weight. And so went off and developed its own institutions, whether it was the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, whether it's the BRICS Bank. And what is striking about the rules of these banks is they're very similar to the rules of the Bretton Woods Order. What is striking about these banks is how many, for example, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, how many of the analysts and employees are former World Bank employees, how much cooperation there is with European countries and with the WTO and with the Asian Development Bank in doing joint loans. It's different than the WTO, but it's not fundamentally different. And that is very much along the same for the rules of the WTO, the rules of the IMF, and so forth. And so, as Victor said, China was a beneficiary of this system. It doesn't want to overthrow this system. The challenge for the world is to negotiate change, and that's just quite difficult for the established powers to yield power and to compromise. The second is the question of how much pressure China is putting on the system for these changes. And there again, I think we're seeing a moderate China. China sees the security order of East Asia as fundamentally opposed to its interests. After all, there was American naval hegemony all around China's coastal lines, bases in Japan, South Korea, Singapore, de facto Philippines. And so China wants to change that order fundamentally to give it more coastal security. But it is striking how since 1989, China has not used force against any other country in the world. It has used coercive diplomacy. It has created tension. It has created many crises. But compared to other rising powers, such as the United States, Napoleon, Germany, Japan, this is a very moderate rise that China is using its power to threaten other countries, but in a way that's quite moderate compared to the past. After all, about a third of the United States was wrested from Mexico in a war, for example. American gunboat diplomacy in the Caribbean was quite more violent than Chinese gunboat diplomacy in the South China Sea. So even there we see moderation. So the question is, where would we see instability? Where would we see a challenge? And here I would point to the challenge that the OECD countries faced with the rise of Japan as an economic power. We faced a Japan which belonged to the WTO, followed all the WTO rules, but had what we called non-tariff barriers to trade. And so it was fundamentally not a free trade state, not because of the rules of the game, but because of Chinese government intervention on behalf of their domestic industries in ways that denied equal opportunity to the corporations of other countries. That, if you will, has been the fundamental conflict in the United States and China and Europe and China since the emergence of the post-Mao Zedong era. And we have still not seen fundamental change. The pressure is whether China's domestic system will elicit retaliation or responses from other countries that could lead to escalating protectionism. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Jeff, it's your turn. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Vijan. Thanks so much for inviting me. I almost hoped my microphone wouldn't work so I wouldn't have to speak after Professors Gao and Ross. I'm not sure what I can add to what I think were very eloquent points that they raised around China and international order, its vision of the international system. You gave us a couple questions to prepare, and I'll go ahead and just try to answer them in ways that hopefully can add some additional food for thought on what were, I think, very good comments before. So first, how will China's rise impact the current international order? And I think, without question, the short answer is it will be disruptive, but I think it's also important to note that it's not going to be inherently destructive, right? Without question, China's rise, and I want to qualify that term in just a minute, China's rise is, and will reshape the existing order in ways that I'll get to in a second. But I first want to challenge that central contention that China is rising or will rise. Here, I think we have to kind of move past what has become an unhelpful trope about China's rise and realize China has risen, that it's an essential part of the existing order, that it'll be one of two or perhaps three key nodes within any global order going forward, that China is already challenging US hegemony in Asia. It's moving to challenge US predominance at a global level. This is occurring through material means, a more robust regional and global military presence, and through ideational means, particularly with respect to governance, state-society relations, and human rights. Yet I think to frame this as a China versus US phenomena is, at least from my perspective, really dangerously misleading. There is nothing about international order or order in Asia that necessitates US leadership. Order, as in this effect, is not synonymous with US global predominance. Order, at least from my perspective, rather, is a socially constructed concept that's only as good as its ability to ensure its participating states' interests, regardless of these states' domestic institutions or values. Order is a society of states where formal and informal institutions help contain and manage what would otherwise be anarchy between states, right? Pretty fundamental international relations 101, but quite true. Order belongs to no individual state. It's rather an expression of stateness. In this respect, I think the question of how China will affect international order is a bit of a red herring. It will affect it, for good and bad, much as any state with proportionate capabilities and resources can affect it. It will demand greater representation within existing institutions, and failing this, it will establish new institutions like the AIIB, where it can advance its interests. It will reshape global markets, global trade, and global finance because it will have an outsized role as an international economic provider and consumer. It's going to reshape, and it is reshaping global norms as it advances a more socio-economic understanding of human rights, for instance, in contrast to existing human rights norms that privilege the individual over the state. It's going to reshape global balance of power as it develops its military in line with its economic development and in support of what will naturally be expanded national interests. And it will challenge existing alliances, partnerships, and institutions, again, materially and ideationally, perhaps even developing a Chinese sphere of influence in the Asia-Pacific as a result. Now, how welcome would these changes be? Now, assuming China prioritizes consultation, cooperation, and inclusion in its approach, which I believe it largely does, and avoids coercion, which again, I believe it largely does, we'll be able to see and to determine the support for its approach and its change to the effect that it has on regional order and global order through other states' receptiveness of Chinese activities. And if one looks at Asia as a case study for such receptiveness, one can see rather broad support for engagement with China across East, Southeast, and South Asia and Oceania. While China's involvement in international order could certainly lead to conflict, and particularly if the US continues to see blocking China's development as a national security objective of its own, it could equally lead to greater diversity of thought from which states, institutions, and peoples can benefit. Good institutions or good ideas are good regardless of their country of origin. Now, you also asked, what is China's vision for the international system? Again, I believe this question is a bit of a red herring, as it assumes China's leaders have this grand strategy towards the international system. It's this type of thinking that undergirds the US approach to China, whether with respect to the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, the Indo-Pacific strategy, or the numerous belligerent statements coming out of the Trump White House. The sense here is that China's approach to the world is determined by some long-term nefarious plan that, because Chinese are so different, is inherently sinister or tricky. Chinese foreign policy, like all states, is determined by national interests, which in a nutshell are territorial integrity, security of Chinese communities and individuals abroad, economic development and development of prestige, or for the sake of China, the rejuvenation of China's regional and global role. I think to achieve these ends, China has a foreign policy that in some ways is best conceptualized as concentric rings, right? Where the priority of its foreign policy is on the peripheral stability and security, an approach predicated on the development of relations and ties with its peripheral states, one with a focus on its near abroad, where it primarily works through bilateral and multilateral consultation, much of which is naturally asymmetric to achieve its goals, and through its far abroad, where its development priorities, where it prioritizes actually market access in developing economies and uses aid, conditional loans, and foreign direct investment to develop its relations with developing countries such as those in Africa. Now, is China's approach perfect? Of course not. Its activities in the South China Sea, while eminently understandable from Beijing's perspective with regard to its national security, is problematic. But let's take a moment here to remember that there are multiple state claimants to disputed areas in the South China Sea, some of which have undertaken land reclamation and island building to cement their claims. China differs here only in terms of its scale of its claims and activities. Nevertheless, China remains committed to regional dialogue with ASEAN member states on a code of conduct in the South China Sea, which for the sake of regional stability, the Western world should support, so long as the South China Sea's international waters remain open to trade and international ships can pass through the South China Sea without hassle, which at present they can. So in short, I think China's vision of the international system is one where it can better achieve its national interests, where it has the ability to affect regional and global outcomes in its favor, and where it has the ability to withstand pressure from other states. You also asked us how the international community can avoid another Cold War scenario or even military conflict during this period of adjustment and changes. And I'll just make a couple of quick points here. Give China the space it deserves as the world's most populous country and as either its first or second largest economy, depending on how one judges such things. And understand that as China expands its international presence, some states will naturally have to step back.
Jeff, if you don't mind, let me actually ask you in the follow-up about that, because that's going to be one of my follow-up questions. I'm going to ask you about that. So let me go back to Victor, and I want to specifically ask you about the Asia-Pacific security architecture. Prime Minister of Singapore wrote a piece recently for Foreign Affairs about US-China competition and the Asia-Pacific security architecture. Here's a quote from that piece that I'm going to read briefly for you, and then I want to hear your perspective. Chinese President Xi Jinping has said that the Pacific Ocean is big enough to accommodate both the United States and China. But he has also said that Asian security should be left to Asians. A natural question arises: does Xi think that the Pacific Ocean is big enough for the United States and China to coexist peacefully, or that it is big enough to be divided down the middle between the two powers into rival spheres of influence? So what do you think, Victor? What is China's perspective on the Asia-Pacific security? And does China want to force regional countries to pick sides between US and China?
Thank you very much. You know for sure, and our audience knows for sure, that China has very complicated geopolitical situations. China has altogether 14 land neighboring countries and half a dozen maritime neighboring countries. This is very, very complicated compared with the US situation, where it only has Canada to its north and Mexico to its south, for example. And China has existed for about several thousand years, and historically speaking, there are lots of complications in China's relations with its neighboring countries. That's for sure. Now, China's foreign policy is built upon four major pillars. One of these major pillars is China's relations with its neighboring countries, maritime neighboring countries, as well as land neighboring countries. Therefore, Southeast Asia as a whole falls within this very important pillar of China's foreign policy, and how to really engage with these countries on equal terms and refuse to be distracted by our historical liabilities, and looking forward into the future to be try to maximize mutual benefit for all the parties concerned is a key for China's foreign policy. Now, you may know China is already the largest trading nation for more than 120 countries in the world. And for the other countries, China is either the second largest or the third largest. So China's impact, economically speaking, on almost all the countries in the world is for the record. And ASEAN as a bloc is already the largest trading nation of China. The trading volume is ahead of China-US trading volume, which is declining, actually, very unfortunately, over the past 3 years, and over the China-EU trading volume. So you can see that ASEAN is not only important neighboring countries, but also very, very important economic partners. Now, when President Xi Jinping says the Pacific is big enough to accommodate both China and the United States, I think he really meant the Pacific is big enough to accommodate China, the United States, and all the other countries in the world. Because why should we artificially divide the Pacific? The Pacific is for mankind to use, in a sense. But when President Xi Jinping says Asian affairs should be left for Asian countries, then definitely the United States has been calling itself a Pacific country, but it has never called itself an Asian country. I'll be surprised if the United States will ever do that. The US has tremendous vested interest in Asia, of course, but that doesn't make America an Asian country. When we say Asian affairs need to be left for Asian countries, I think we mean we do not need to have interventions or interferences from outside powers in this region, because they may bring their own ulterior motives or their own version of the geopolitical pursuits, which may not be compatible to the fundamental interests of the people in the Asian region as a whole. So I don't think China's views of its relations with the Asian countries is at odds with the US interest in this part of the world, on the condition that US is not really pursuing hegemony. The US is not really imposing its view onto the other countries. Now, we talked about the South China Sea. We can talk more about it. But one thing is that China is right now at peace with all the countries surrounding the South China Sea. There is no war. There is no conflict. There is no dying situation for any emergency, for example. So why should the United States constantly send more and more naval ships and airplanes, and you name it, into this very important passageway? Now, if peace and navigation are to be disrupted in the South China Sea, which country will be the worst victim? China. China depends on the South China Sea for the bulk of its commerce with the rest of the world. So China, in a sense, has greater vested interest in protecting freedom of navigation in the South China Sea than probably the United States. That's for sure. We do not need such intervention from a superpower in this part of the world, which now seems to be instigating for more troubles and even urging certain parties which are now at peace with China to pick up fight with China. This is very dangerous. This is what we need to raise as a red flag for mankind to see who is really instigating for more ominous development in the South China Sea. It's not China.
Thank you, Victor.
It's the other power. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Victor. Robert, you recently wrote in your article, and I'm quoting briefly, constrained competition requires U.S. adjustment to the power transition and acknowledgement of Chinese interests in a revised regional security order. So let me ask you this question. Are you advocating for granting China spheres of influence? If so, how would you respond to critiques such as former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, who believe retrenchment and spheres of influence will just embolden strategic adversaries?
So I think first it's critical to understand that the day of American maritime dominance in East Asia is over. And that's the fundamental starting point of thinking about what America needs to do in order to respond to the rise of China, or in Jeffrey's words, to a risen China. China's shipbuilding rate, its technologies, so on and so forth, defense spending, mean that it is futile over the next decade or more for the United States to try and develop maritime dominance. Just not possible. And you can see this on the part of the United States by its, in one sense, it's already its retrenchment. The Indo-Pacific strategy is an effort to replace our strategic partnerships in the South China Sea with new strategic partnerships far from China. India, Australia, Japan, countries in the Western Pacific. So, and you quoted from Li Shenlong in his article in Foreign Affairs, and I will quote a different statement from him in that same article. He says, a critical difference with the United States as compared to China is that for the Chinese, the Asia-Pacific is essential to its own security, in contrast to the United States, in which it's far away. So it is incumbent upon the United States, one, to deal with the reality that has to adjust to a bipolar East Asia. And second, to acknowledge that China has critical interests, and the only way to maintain stability is to acknowledge those interests and make the adjustments necessary. Now, you asked earlier whether China wants to force countries to change sides. I would think it would like to very much, but its ambition is far short of its capabilities. This is going to be a bipolar region, not a hegemonic Chinese region. And in that context, the smaller countries of East Asia, Philippines, South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, will be able to navigate this bipolar region so they won't have to choose sides. And that makes this region a far more benign region than Europe. We're not seeing the emergence of polarized blocs with minimal economic, political, diplomatic, cultural cooperation among the great powers. That's not happening here. This is a cross-cutting relationships with the United States and China are going to have military exercises with Singapore. We're both going to trade with Singapore. And so whether China wants to or not, it's not in its power to achieve that objective. And the United States, whether it would like to keep those allies it's all its own, is not in its power to achieve those objectives. Now, we need to keep in mind that when America talks about freedom of navigation, that's all pretext. The United States does freedom of navigation exercises around the world with many countries, including Canada, once a year to establish a legal principle. But China, we do it once a month. And it's not doing it for freedom of navigation. It's doing it to try and stand up to China to show America's tough and has a resolve to resist the rise of China. There's no threat to freedom of navigation. Victor is correct. The United States, on the one hand, is resisting, but it's futile. Second thing to keep in mind is the region has a relatively benign view of China because China, Jeffrey's right, it has different norms, but it doesn't even export those norms. China's like the United States, where if you are a friend, I don't care what your ideology is, your political system, perhaps the most repressive system in the world is Saudi Arabia, and we don't care. China works with whoever, whom it works with, and in some respects, better than the United States, Victor. The United States was intent on exporting democracy. China just wants to do business. So in some ways, ideologically, they pose less a threat to the international system than the United States. Finally, we talk about China's behavior in the South China Sea as problematic. These are relative terms. Is China aggressive? Is China belligerent? Is China problematic? I would only suggest to you that as a great power exercising its power, it's a lot less problematic than the United States in the Middle East. And if the United States were to behave with such restraint, as Bijan said is an objective of the Institute, I think the world would be a better place.
Okay, thank you, Robert. And I just want to remind our audience, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to send in your questions. Some questions were sent to us earlier in email. I'm going to fit in those questions as we're going forward. Jeff, I want to ask you about the perspective of other countries on China's rise, especially middle powers, including Canada. Are they ready or willing to accept adjustments to the current US-led international order? And if you want to also complete your comments from the previous round, please go ahead as well.
Sure. I think maybe when we talk about the role of middle powers and in the US-China geopolitical rivalry and what role like a state like Canada can play, in particular, I think maybe thinking a little bit about that. I think, for Canada in particular, Canada should not, and I'd say this absolutely should not align with or partner with the United States against China. I think far from being in a country like Canada's interests, alignment with the US would not only harm Canada's relations with China, but it'll also limit its room for maneuver within the broader Asia Pacific. And I think that probably is true about any middle power in the Asia Pacific that's thinking about whether or not to hitch its wagon to the United States foreign and security policy approach to the Asia Pacific. This is because the United States approach to China is not about China, but rather it's about US domestic failings across its economy, its education system, its state-society relations, and Washington's strange contention that the US is a victim within the US-China relationship, that it's gained nothing from engagement with China and it has actually lost by engaging with China. This is obviously fundamental nonsense. US firms have made billions in China over the past decades, and US consumers have benefited enormously from the prevalence of inexpensive Chinese goods in US markets. The complaint from the business community is that they aren't making as much as they could, that China still protects key industries at the cost of US market penetration. The reality, I think, is far different than the rhetoric coming from the Trump administration that China is eating our lunch. For middle powers like Canada, to follow course would be to internalize the US pathologies towards China at the cost of middle power economic diversification in Asia. What should be any middle power's primary foreign policy goals, including Canada's. Canada, again, with reference back to the country that we're in, should instead use its national interests, I think, to craft its approach to China, understanding that the relationship is going to be hard and problematic, and that Canada is inherently disadvantaged due to the asymmetry inherent in bilateral relations. For Canada, though, this isn't, or for middle powers, this is nothing new. Canada has had to manage the same set of relations with the US, which particularly under the Trump administration has bullied Canada with tariffs, threatened Canada over Huawei, and placed Canada in a very untenable situation with China with respect to Meng Wanzhou's extradition request. Now, for middle power diplomacy, I'm not sure how to answer this. Middle powers, by definition, lack agency to shape international order and require coalition building to drive change. And within Asia, Canada's ability to engage in middle power multilateralism is limited, honestly, as it's not demonstrated, I think, a strategic resolve within Asia to the degree where it's a respected actor. It's not a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asian Summit, or an active member of CSCAP. It's a CPTPP or TPP country, but this gives it little political leverage. So I think Canada and other middle powers' options to affect change are really extremely limited. This means that middle powers in Canada are going to have to operate in a regional environment over which they have little control. For Canada, I think to best achieve its strategic end state within Asia, it's going to have to develop a strategic approach that prioritizes flexibility and issue-specific policies rather than some sort of grand strategy, particularly with respect to alignment. Now, this will mean remaining open, I think, to as wide set of partners as possible, while not entering into any partnership that any Asian state see as exclusive. And I'd specifically reference here this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which is being put forward as a good middle power strategy for engaging in Asia. I think Canada must step very, very carefully around this concept because I think it's becoming increasingly laden with anti-Chinese sentiments, particularly the view coming from Washington, D.C. It will mean investing in and developing, I think, the best domestic capacity in Canada to understand the complexities of the Asian region, with which Canada, unfortunately, at this current state and time, sorely lacks. I think while we like to compare ourselves to Australia and Canada, the reality is that Canada is decades behind Australia in thinking of investing in Asian competence or Asian literacy, and that the result is that Canadians rarely think about the Asia Pacific outside of British Columbia, and that Asian states rarely think about Canada more than an appendage of the United States foreign policy. I think maybe going back to what the international community can do to minimize the risk of conflict with China, I just want to reiterate this idea of giving China the space that it deserves, right? And understanding that this will come at a cost of established relations that states have right now. Now, this doesn't mean that China's rise will be a zero-sum game with some states losing while China wins, but realization that China deserves a principal seat at any institution and that all states must work with China to ensure its inclusion so to avoid a scenario where China feels excluded. Stop securitizing everything that China does, such as classifying its economic relations as debt diplomacy or its bilateral relations as a return to China's tributary system. Stop treating Chinese development of a national defense capability as offensive in nature. Why do we insist on seeing China's coastal defense, which all states that can have one do, as anti-access and area denial, rather than simply a defensive capability, right? Why do we see China's use of a maritime militia in its coastal waters as gray zone activities rather than coastal defense? Is China's right to defend itself less justifiable than the US Navy's insistence that it'll fly, sail, and operate wherever it's allowed by international law? We have to deal with China as it is, not as we want it. And as someone who spent years living and working in China and who studied Mandarin to better understand Chinese primary resources and who spends a lot of time in other Asian states talking about China, I find this Western supposition that Chinese people are oppressed and desire some sort of regime change laughable at best and ignorant at worst. China is a relatively stable and prosperous country it is today because of its political, social, and economic institutions, not despite them. And I think we can debate whether the economy would grow faster with less state involvement or whether China's unique system has allowed it to deal more effectively with systemic crises than Western nations, which I think demonstratively it has. But to suggest that the average Chinese citizen wants regime change or sees him or herself as a victim is patronizing. And I guess my last point, which is going to be controversial, is that it's the United States, I genuinely believe, not China, that's driving towards this new Cold War dynamic. As Professor Ross said, China is not seeking to export an alternative model globally, nor has it couched the terms of its engagement with the US in Cold War terms. It's Washington and primarily the Trump administration that's driving conflict with China, first through this trade war and now through a declaration of mistrust but verify, the closure of a Chinese consulate in Houston, the exclusion of Chinese students from US higher education institution, I genuinely believe that Washington needs to stop vilifying China's activities abroad and instead develop America's capacity to compete. And this won't happen by pressuring allies to stop working with Chinese firms for dubious security reasons. Rather, it will only happen, I think, if the US empowers itself to compete with China rather than seek to contain it.
Thank you, Jeff. Victor, here's a question emailed to us. You work closely with Deng Xiaoping, whose fundamental approach was to prioritize economic development and avoid conflicts abroad. How do you characterize President Xi's foreign policy in comparison to previous Chinese leaders?
Thank you very much. Yes, around 1984, in the heat of the Cold War, Deng Xiaoping said to the Chinese leaders that he believed that the megatrend in the world is still peace and development. And he believed that the World War, or the Third World War, will not happen anytime soon. So China should not waste money on developing armaments. For example, China should spare the very precious money. At that time, China was still very poor, on economic development. And this actually saved China. China was not caught up in the Cold War arms race with the United States or with the former Soviet Union. And China used a lot of its resources for improving the economic development. A few days ago, Xi Jinping declared that he believed that the megatrend of our time today is still peace and development. It's not the arms race. It's not China-US rivalry, for example. It is developing our economy to improve the likelihood for peace and stand firm for peace rather than being agitated for war. This is the megatrend of our times. And I hope countries around the world, including, for example, the great country of Canada, should be a force for peace rather than being dragged along onto a path of war with any country, including with China. A war between China and the United States will be catastrophe for mankind. These are two heavily armed nuclear powers, and any indulgence that the conflict between China and the United States should remain in the conventional sphere will be indulging in dangerous fantasies, because escalation into non-conventional war will be imminent. And then the two countries will be in a very dangerous a circle of a mutually assured destruction, which will be a calamity for mankind. So all of us need to cry out for peace and oppose firmly any attempt for war between China and the United States, or between the United States and any other country. So I would say today's world is still very much committed for peace and development, rather than, for example, as several warmongers in Washington are clamoring, they probably want to bring disaster not only to the Chinese people, but to the people of the United States. And I believe China is not an enemy of the United States, and the Chinese people are not enemies of the American people. We can find a way to get along with each other today or 15 years later. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert, I want to, many people actually ask us this question about the impact of the November election. So if two basically outcomes possible, Biden or re-election of Trump. If Biden wins, will US-China relations, in your opinion, go back to pre-Trump normal, if we want to call it that, or at least move towards a more stable and predictable approach? And what will happen, do you think, if Trump is re-elected? Do you think he will continue this current path, or is this current path more, has some elements of election strategy and domestic politics in it, that he might change this after election if he's re-elected?
Thank you. So let's begin by understanding that the United States and China are not going to be partners. We're not going to be friends. We're not going to be allies. The two most powerful countries in the international system are destined to be competitors. And as China rises, that competition will become more intense. I think that's simply inevitable, and that's not a figure of our imagination. That's just that all those weapons in those two countries are just a problem for them both to deal with. But that doesn't answer the question, what kind of competitive relationship? And Because the United States and China have no ideological barriers, China is a relatively open country compared to many countries in the world. There are many opportunities for cooperation as well as conflict. The strategic relationship can be highly competitive, and yet in some areas we can have a common interest. And that's where I think a Biden administration would be different. Donald Trump has said very clearly he wants to decouple, not just economics, but education, culture, politics, diplomacy. The United States Embassy in Beijing, even before COVID, was basically shut down in its dialogues with China. There was no cooperation. One of the first things that a President Biden would do would be to announce America's commitment to rejoin the WHO and to work with China to strengthen it. One of the first things he would do would be to rejoin the Paris Accords and commit to working with China to deal with climate change. You cannot deal with climate change, you cannot deal with global pandemics unless there is US-China cooperation. He understands that. The trade war. It does not need to be blanket. It can be in certain sectors, the United States needs to be protectionist. In others, it can cooperate. He's called this a disastrous trade war. He will inherit an economy that's in deep trouble and needs to expand exports for growth. His constituency is labor. So I would think there would be a moderation of the trade war. It'll take a while. It cannot happen overnight because of American domestic politics and the inevitable accusations from Republicans that Biden is soft on China. But over time, we can walk it back to a relationship where we cooperate where we can and compete where we must. Now, God forbid, forgive me for showing my hand, what would a second Trump administration, the second term for the Trump administration mean? And I fear it would be worse than the first term. Freed from the constraints of re-election, freed from the constraints of worrying about public opinion, he would be more active on Twitter, more active in making policy on the fly, more active in retaliating against countries that dare to stand up to him, and that would be China. There would be nothing that would contribute to the continued rise of China more than another 4 years of Donald Trump. This is why many Chinese say they hope for another 4 years of Donald Trump. It's been good for China because the decline in the American economy has been accelerated under Donald Trump. So Donald Trump wouldn't be good for the world. One could say that the country that is most supportive of international organizations today is China. The country that is most revisionist is Russia, and the country that is most destructive is the United States. That would accelerate under Donald Trump.
Thank you, Robert. Jeffrey, this might be the last question or the second last question we can cover. I'm going to read the question as it was submitted. Where do you see India factoring into this discussion and this topic? And why does it, and I quote, why does its profile seem not to reflect its size in Asia?
India has an independent foreign policy that, like most nations, prioritizes its own national interests. I think if you look, for example, at the interpretation that it's put forward around the Indo-Pacific concept, much of that is directed towards developing economic and commercial and political ties with states in Southeast Asia. With it, I think it rightfully sees in many ways as the center of gravity within Asia, and particularly with respect to India's future move east or act east policy. Southeast Asia and the ASEAN member states are going to be critical to that. I think it obviously sees China as a strategic challenger to a certain extent within the Indian Ocean as China's naval development continues at pace and China becomes more active within that region. But I don't necessarily see that the Modi administration in particular has put forward an idea of China as a threat as much as a strategic challenger that needs a concurrent development within India's own Air Force and naval force to have matching capabilities in order to ensure continued trade with the Middle East and North Africa, which India is becoming increasingly dependent on for its energy imports. But India is also very, I think, keen on taking advantage of its geopolitical space, right? Understanding that if we are now moving into an Indo-Pacific age, it is at the fulcrum of essentially the Pacific and Indian Ocean coming together, the confluence of the two of them. And that ultimately its economic future is going to be dependent on whether or not it can affect a foreign policy that brings together its east and west coasts. China is going to be a key part of that, and I believe that when the Modi government looks at Pakistan, for instance, it's concerned about the relationship between Beijing and China, or Beijing and Pakistan. But at the same time, I think that the Modi government has not moved into a position where it is willing to identify, as the United States, and indeed as Australia is increasingly doing, of China as a strategic challenger or a strategic threat. It has tried to sit on the fence, even with respect to the Quad, which is now becoming, I think, in many ways an anti-China institution. India has stepped very carefully around being involved in that, and being assigning the Quad with any sort of strategic quality, even when it acts with Quad nations in order to make sure that it doesn't isolate China or perpetuate this foreign policy image of trying to isolate China within Asia or within the Indian Ocean.
Thank you, Jeff. And with that, we're getting to the end of our discussion. There were many more questions submitted, but unfortunately, we don't have more time to cover those. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you for your time. Thanks for being with us today. The video of this discussion will be available on our website and our YouTube channel. For more information, please visit our website, peacediplomacy.org. There will be more panel discussions in the coming months, so please check our website and join our Twitter account and other platforms that we are there to get those information. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you.